Hey, I'm Professor Cole, and I'm taking you to school. Okay, I thought we should do some history. Personally, I'm a student of history. I always have been. Big fan of it. Always just been a big interest of mine. Pretty much, if there's a subject out there, that I'm interested in, it only makes sense to me to find out about its history. I don't really expect everybody in the world to be as into history as I am, but I just can't really understand people that have no interest in it, or people that say, oh, this happened this long, X amount of years ago, or whatever. How does this affect me now, or why should I care? That's a that's kind of a stupid, limited way of viewing the world. You really can't understand the world around you as it is if you don't have any understanding of what came before. So, the stuff that I consider myself somewhat of an authority on, just because I'm into it a lot, like hockey, rock and roll, comics. Those are things that I really like to get into discussions about the history on. So that's what we're going to try out today. A little different from my usual thing. This should be quite long. I'll probably have to break it up into a few pieces, but hopefully just keep it going here. Alright, so I wanted to talk about a specific era in comics. And obviously, I'm not just going to be throwing facts and information at you because, well, quite honestly, why would you come to me for that? You can get them lots of other places, websites and books and things like that. So, I'm trying to mix in my own personal experiences with that and my own thoughts and reflections on things now as they stand looking back. Okay, so the era I want to talk about in question is, well, we all know that with comics, they're broken into various ages and understood eras. Sort of blurs the line when one ends and one begins. As that works in pretty much any era you want to work in history and that sort of thing. It's not like one day or 1 week, even maybe sometimes not even 1 year really marks the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. But what's understood is, we have the golden age of comics, when comics were in their infancy and first came out, and right from the get-go invented sort of the superhero comic in the late 30s, going into the 40s. That's the golden age. And then the 50s, sort of a dead era, which you can still say is partially the golden age, and that the silver age started somewhere in the late 50s. It really got going around 1961, the early 60s, especially because of what was going on with Marvel. So many creations, a lot having to do with Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, those people. Spider-Man in 1961, I believe, his first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15. In 1962, we have the Fantastic Four. Also, I think the Hulk. By 1964-65, we've got the X-Men in their first incarnation. Didn't fare as well as the others, but it would be picked up later. But so that's the Silver Age, which is a lot of people see sort of as like really the most classic age there is as far as comics goes, at least as far as superheroes goes. Because even though it's the Silver Age, if you want to take it outside the context, you can say that was sort of the Golden Age, the era, which is confusing, I know. But I just mean because so many iconic characters were introduced, and storylines and things like that, and just sort of, especially, again, focusing on Marvel and DC especially, really when these companies were starting to like find their voice and their direction. And something that's sort of interesting is now, today, even in 2010, even though finally, especially within the last 10 years or so, comics have certainly become more mainstream than they've ever been. This has a lot to do, of course, to do with the movie industry and things like that. But even today, if you like take the average non-comic reader off the street and sort of wanted to ask them some questions on what they thought of comics, a lot of the most uninformed people sort of have an idea, I think, that is sort of stuck in the Silver Age. I think they really, people that don't know anything about comics and don't show any interest, I think a lot of them, they just, through pop culture and stuff, just had this vague, hazy impression that comics is still basically where it was back then in the Silver Age, with the superheroes and the smiling and the corny jokes and things like that, and sort of predictable writing. Again, I'm not trying to put down the Silver Age because it was great, and it's always a mistake looking back in history to think that just because something came before that it's simpler or less important or less refined. Less refined is fair enough, I suppose, but you know what I mean. It's always a mistake to look back at those comics and just say that that they were easy, they were simple, anybody could do them. But again, I sort of do believe that is the mentality that a lot of people have, that when they think about comics, they jump right to superheroes, of course, which makes a lot of sense. To this day, comics is a medium that is simultaneously dominated and, well, embarrassed, really, by the superhero stuff. And that's fair enough, I suppose. Okay, but see, this is why this is going to be quite long. And the good news for you and me is, I'm hopefully going to try to just sort of do this all in one shot, whatever. But I'll be breaking it up, and even then, the good thing about YouTube is you can just watch this at whatever pace suits you best, and hopefully I won't be too boring. Okay, so the Silver Age is understood to have ended somewhere around the early 70s, 1973 the absolute latest. Some people see one of the big events that led to the end of this, I've mentioned before, was in Marvel Comics, the death of Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man. And, of course, the whole idea then was shift into what was then the Bronze Age. Bronze follows silver, makes sense, I suppose. Was that, comics were growing up a little. It was going to be a little more complex. It was going to be a little more serious, a little more dark. The 70s saw, of course, all sorts of new characters that were sort of like anti-heroes in a way, more dark loner characters, a lot of horror comics, of course, too, horror-themed stuff, Ghost Rider, the Son of Satan. I'm sorry, my brain is just wired to Marvel. There's obviously non-Marvel stuff in there, too, even to a certain extent, a lot of the Conan-type stuff, and again, comics were getting a little more graphic, a little more real world in some ways absolutely not. For instance, Jack Kirby, who wanted to sort of reinvent what he was doing, went off in a more like sort of cosmic direction. And opinions are very split on Kirby's sort of comeback to comics after he'd left Marvel and been working at DC and then coming back to Marvel again. Was that, all the magic of the Silver Age in the 60s was sort of gone. And his new ideas for, like, in the 70s, the New Gods, most specifically, and most center stage there, a lot of people think it was more of a clunky bygone age that didn't really work. Or some people thought, no, this really fit, it was really trippy, it was really cerebral. Again, I wasn't even alive back then, so obviously I wasn't reading comics, so it's really hard to gauge those sorts of things, but if you talk to people that were reading comics back then, specifically Marvel and DC, the big stuff, and if they'd been familiar with Kirby's work beforehand and then going into what it was becoming, you'll get all sorts of, I'm sure, split opinions and ideas on that. But anyway, I'm going off on a Jack Kirby tangent that I only have time for. But again, the 70s saw this influx of, I'm going to use the word dark a lot, which is kind of annoying, and I don't like overusing it. It's one of my favorite terms, it's one of my favorite things, but I hate overusing any term. So anyway, the Bronze Age was seen to continue into the 80s, and is mostly understood to end sometime around 1986. A lot of big events were happening leading up to this. The early 80s was really the beginning of crossovers, starting with Secret Wars, and then, of course, 1986 had several very large events. Not the least among them was the DC restructuring, the big crossover, Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, is that really an event that was important to the closing of the Bronze Age? I'm not sure, but it did happen around the same time. And of course, the other things people point to, again, about things becoming more graphic and mature, is when you've got creators like Alan Moore and Frank Miller, who are really starting to come into their own. Both had done earlier works that they created themselves and controlled that had darker, maybe more mature, more serious, cerebral themes, such as V for Vendetta, which I believe was in 1982. I think in the following year, that was when Miller released Ronin. But anyway, 86 was sort of when maybe their alleged masterpieces came out. And you have one which was very interesting because it crosses over into the superhero genre, and of course that is The Dark Knight Returns. I wanted to show you my copy till I remember I don't have it with me. My mom has it, she's reading it. Don't believe me? It's true. But, which of course is a very dark, gritty sort of deconstruction of the superhero genre in some ways, and just showing, and it really showed a direction that comics were going to take, which is kind of funny, because it's this alternate future. It's like, well, we hope this isn't what becomes of Batman, but who knows? And it sort of was,